All right, let's do this. Time to dive deep, deep into the world of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Deep dive is right. This is Nietzsche, after all.
Exactly. We're going to focus specifically on, his views on morality and politics. And since you mentioned you're a philosopher, well, let's just say we can skip Nietzsche 101 today.
Sounds good to me.
Perfect. So maybe we could start with what Nietzsche even means by morality.
Right, because it's definitely not exactly what we talk about in everyday conversation, right?
Yeah. So how is it different?
Well, one thing that's really interesting is that he's not, against morality altogether. It's more like he's, exposing what he sees as the problems with traditional moral systems, especially ones based on Judeo-Christian values. He kind of sees those as promoting what he calls a herd morality that stops individuals from really growing and being creative.
So not anti-ethics, but anti a very specific type of ethics.
You got it. He thinks traditional morality is built on some shaky assumptions, like take the idea of free will, the idea that we are ultimately responsible for our actions.
Right.
Well, Nietzsche really challenges that, head on.
Interesting.
He argues that what we do is mostly determined by, our psychology and our physiology, basically stuff we just don't control. He even uses this analogy of trying to pull yourself out of a swamp by your own hair, which I always thought was pretty funny, just to show how absurd this idea of self-causation is.
Yeah, I can see how that would kind of mess with, our traditional ideas about moral responsibility. So if we don't have this radical free will, then what? Does that mean we can't be held accountable for what we do at all?
Well, that's a really key question, and it's something that Nietzsche really struggles with throughout all his work.
Yeah.
I mean, his point isn't that we are totally off the hook for what we do. It's more that we need to rethink what that responsibility is even based on. If what we do is ultimately determined by things we can't control, then what does that say about guilt or punishment or even, praise?
That makes sense. It sounds like he's really making us rethink the whole foundation of how we think about ethics. He's asking us to look deeper, beyond the surface, to see the motivations and drives that actually shape what we do.
Exactly. And this leads him to, another really big criticism of traditional morality, which is that we can fully understand our own motivations.
Oh, interesting.
He argues that a lot of times we're actually fooling ourselves about why we do things. We think we know, but our conscious understanding of our motives is really just the tip of the iceberg, right? There's a whole world of unconscious drives and instincts underneath.
So even if we think we're being totally altruistic, Nietzsche might say, hold on, there might be other, maybe not so noble motives at play.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like he's offering, you could say a kind of proto-Freudian critique of consciousness, unmasking the hidden desires and power dynamics that really shape how we act.
Right.
It's all connected.
Okay, that's kind of unsettling. It makes you wonder about the real motives even behind, even our most deeply held beliefs. If he's right, it's like we're always, kind of deceiving ourselves, projecting our own biases and desires onto the world.
And that brings us to another key critique, which is this assumption that one moral code fits everybody. Nietzsche argues that this idea of a universal morality is not only unrealistic, but it's actually harmful, especially for these individuals he calls, higher men.
Okay, let's talk about this higher man idea, because that's one of Nietzsche's most famous concepts.
Yeah.
But it's also, probably one of his most misunderstood. What does he actually mean by it?
Right. Well, for Nietzsche, a higher man isn't defined by, their social status or their wealth or anything like that.
Okay.
It's about a type of individual who represents human excellence, someone who pushes the limits of what humans can do in every area of life. Think of figures like Goethe, Beethoven, and he modestly suggests this himself.
Right. So it's not about being born into privilege. It's about reaching a certain level of self-cultivation and creative expression.
Exactly. And for Nietzsche, traditional morality, with its emphasis on self-denial and fitting in, actually gets in the way of these exceptional people developing. It's like, as he says, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Right.
You might be able to force it, but you're going to end up damaging both the peg and the hole.
I love that. So this higher man idea, it's fascinating, but it also seems to contradict his point about free will, doesn't it?
Huh.
If what we do is predetermined by forces we can't control, how can anyone become this, higher?
Yeah, you're right. That's a really sharp observation, and it highlights a tension that runs right through Nietzsche's work. On the one hand, he's saying we're largely shaped by, our biology and how we're raised. But then on the other hand, he's also pushing for this radical self-creation, this idea that we can be the authors of our own lives.
All right, so are these two ideas just, like, totally incompatible? Or is there a way to make them, work together?
Well, that is the million-dollar question. Nietzsche scholars have been debating this for, well, over a century. Maybe the key is understanding how our natural predispositions and our ability to overcome ourselves work together. But, that's maybe a conversation for another time. For now, let's stick to what Nietzsche sees as the dangers of holding on to a universal, one-size-fits-all morality.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more about how this herd morality, as he calls it, actually holds us back, especially these higher men. What is it about it that he objects to?
Well, one of his main criticisms is that traditional morality often puts comfort and security above growth and self-actualization. It encourages us to avoid pain and suffering at all costs, even if that means giving up our potential for greatness.
It's almost like he's saying that focusing too much on happiness can actually make us weaker, less able to deal with the challenges that life throws at us.
You got it. He uses this great analogy of Frand. Like if you try to get rid of all the rough edges in life, all the friction and hardship, you end up with a bunch of smooth, identical grains of sand.
Right.
They're indistinguishable and ultimately kind of meaningless. It's the challenges, the suffering we go through that give our lives shape and meaning.
That's such a powerful image. It really challenges the idea that happiness should be, our ultimate goal. He seems to be saying that a life that's just about pleasure and comfort might be pleasant enough, but it would also be pretty shallow and unfulfilling.
Exactly. He sees traditional morality as promoting a kind of complacency, a fear of really experiencing the full range of human experience, including, the darker, more difficult parts. And he thinks this ultimately leads to a kind of spiritual stagnation, a stifling of the creative impulse that drives us forward.
This is all really insightful. I have to say, though, it's also a little daunting. If Nietzsche's right, then reaching this higher state isn't just about following a set of rules,
Yeah.
or adhering to a specific dogma. It's about a much deeper shift in perspective, a willingness to embrace discomfort and uncertainty, to go after something greater. But how do we even begin to cultivate that kind of mindset? And what specific values does Nietzsche offer in place of this, herd morality that he critiques?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Well, Nietzsche, he doesn't offer like a neat list of, commandments or virtues. He's, remember, very suspicious of any fixed system.
Right, right.
Instead, he points us towards certain qualities, certain ways of being that he sees as typical of this higher type.
So it's less about following rules and more about, like, cultivating a certain disposition, a way of approaching life.
Exactly. And one of the most important qualities he talks about is self-overcoming. For Nietzsche, this isn't about, suppressing our desires or emotions, but
Right.
rather channeling them towards goals that affirm life and are creative. It's about pushing past what we think our limitations are, constantly trying to become more than we are.
That reminds me a bit of Aristotle's idea of virtue as, a kind of excellence, striving towards our full potential.
Right.
But Nietzsche seems to take it a step further. He's suggesting that this self-overcoming isn't just about becoming virtuous, it's about going beyond conventional morality altogether.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Nietzsche sees traditional morality as a kind of crutch, something that holds us back from achieving real greatness. It's like, he says, training wheels that we need to get rid of if we want to ride freely and confidently.
Yeah, I like that analogy. So for Nietzsche, the higher type isn't bound by the same rules and constraints as the average person. It's almost like they're playing a different game.
Exactly. And that leads us to another key characteristic of this higher type, which is their ability to create their own values. Remember, Nietzsche rejects the idea of objective moral facts.
Right.
For him, values are ultimately expressions of our will to power, this fundamental drive we have to grow, to overcome resistance and shape the world in our own way.
Okay, so this will to power, it seems pretty central to his whole ethical framework.
Yes.
But it's also one of his most controversial ideas,
Yeah.
right? It's often misinterpreted as just being about domination and aggression.
Right.
Can you help us unpack it a little?
Yeah.
What did he really mean by will to power?
Yeah, for Nietzsche, will to power is much more subtle than just a raw desire for dominance. It's the fundamental creative force that drives all living things. The urge to expand, to express oneself, to overcome limits, and achieve a kind of mastery.
Okay.
You can see it in all sorts of things, like an artist struggling to create a masterpiece,
Right.
or a scientist searching for knowledge, or an athlete pushing for physical excellence.
So it's not just about brute force or control over others. It's about this deeper drive towards self-realization, striving for excellence in all parts of life.
Exactly. The higher man, they embody this will to power in its most refined and creative form. They don't want to dominate others, but they want to master themselves, become the architects of their own fate.
Okay.
They're driven by a deep love for life, a desire to create, to innovate, and to leave their mark on the world.
So not exactly the picture of Nietzsche as, some kind of proto-fascist. It seems more like he's actually advocating for a kind of radical individualism, a celebration of human potential and creativity.
Yeah.
But, doesn't that create some potential problems?
Mhm.
If everyone is just focused on their own will to power, doesn't that lead to chaos and conflict?
Well, that's a fair point, and Nietzsche acknowledges that. He doesn't shy away from the fact that there can be conflict between different wills to power. He actually sees it as a necessary part of human progress.
Oh, interesting.
New ideas emerge and societies evolve through that clash of perspectives and the struggle for dominance.
So he's not advocating for this utopian harmony where everybody gets along.
Right.
He recognizes that there will be tensions, disagreements, but he sees those as ultimately, productive.
Exactly. He doesn't give us a blueprint for a perfectly harmonious society. What he offers is a vision of a society that embraces dynamism, creativity, even a degree of conflict
Right.
as crucial for human flourishing.
Okay, this is all very insightful, but I can't help but ask, where does this leave us in terms of his actual political views?
Yeah.
I mean, he's definitely critical of traditional morality and how it plays out in society.
Uh-huh.
But what does he propose to replace it?
Well, Nietzsche's political philosophy it's tricky and often misunderstood. He's been called everything from, like we said, a proto-fascist to an anarchist. But I think it's more accurate to say that he's deeply skeptical of all political systems. He sees them as inevitably pushing towards mediocrity and the suppression of individual greatness.
So he's not a big fan of democracy.
He's very critical of the kind of mass democracy that he was seeing develop in the late 19th century. He thought it led to a leveling down of culture, a kind of tyranny of the majority that stifled the development of exceptional people.
So does that mean he thinks there should be an aristocratic elite ruling over everyone else?
Well, not exactly. While he does admire certain aristocratic values, he's not calling for a return to feudalism or any other strict social hierarchy. His main concern is creating the right conditions for higher types to flourish, regardless of their background.
Okay, so how does he see that happening? What kind of society would be best at nurturing these exceptional individuals?
Well, that's where things get really, really interesting. Well, Nietzsche, doesn't exactly give us a detailed political plan. It's more like he throws out these provocations that get us thinking about, the relationship between individuals and society. He believed that a really thriving society, a flourishing society, would be one that really encouraged the rise of great individuals who could push the limits of human achievement in everything, art, science, philosophy, politics, you name it.
So it's not so much about the specific political structures, it's more about creating a cultural environment where these higher types can really develop.
Exactly. He saw traditional morality, with its emphasis on conformity and obedience as a huge roadblock to this kind of cultural flourishing. He thought it stifled creativity, discouraged risk-taking, and basically led to a kind of, spiritual mediocrity.
It's like he's calling for a kind of cultural revolution, a reevaluation of values that puts individual self-realization and the pursuit of excellence first.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. He wanted to wake people up to the possibility of a totally different way of life, one that embraced the full range of human potential, even the darker, more chaotic parts.
But how do we reconcile this idea of radical individualism with the need for some kind of social order? Didn't Nietzsche recognize that some rules, some constraints are necessary for any society to actually function?
Of course, of course. He wasn't, advocating for anarchy or a complete rejection of all social norms. He knew that some degree of order is needed, but he thought that this order should be flexible enough to allow for individual creativity and experimentation. His ideal society, I think, was one that provided fertile ground for the emergence of great individuals, but also recognized that some constraints are needed to prevent chaos and destruction.
So he's kind of walking a tightrope here, trying to balance individual freedom with with social cohesion.
Exactly. And that's what makes his political thought so challenging and so relevant even today. He doesn't offer easy answers or simple solutions. He forces us to really wrestle with those fundamental tensions. The individual versus society, freedom versus order, creativity versus constraint.
Okay, so where does that leave us?
Yeah.
What are we supposed to do with Nietzsche's ideas? How do we apply them to our own lives, to the world around us?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And Nietzsche himself, he wouldn't give us a prescriptive answer. He believed that each individual has to find their own path, to create their own values and strive for greatness in their own way.
So it's not about following a specific political program, a set of rules. It's about something deeper, a kind of existential shift in perspective.
Precisely. Nietzsche is, at heart, a philosopher of self-overcoming, of pushing beyond our perceived limits and embracing the full potential of human existence. He challenges us to question everything, to experiment with different ways of life and to create ourselves anew.
It sounds like a daunting but also incredibly exciting task. Nietzsche doesn't give us any easy answers,
Hmm.
but he does offer us a really powerful vision of what's possible for humans. He's pushing us to become the artists of our own lives,
Yeah.
to embrace that creative impulse that's at the core of human nature.
And that's maybe his greatest legacy. He reminds us that we're not just products of our circumstances, we're active participants in creating our own destiny. We have the power to shape our own lives and contribute to the evolution of human culture.
Well, I think we finally reached the top of this Nietzschean mountain. I have to admit, it's been a challenging climb, but the view from up here is truly amazing. Thanks for guiding us through this intellectual landscape. You've helped us make sense of some really complex and challenging ideas, and I think we've all come out of this deep dive a little wiser, and maybe, just maybe, a little more Nietzschean ourselves.
The pleasure was all mine, and I would definitely encourage our listeners to keep going, to delve deeper into Nietzsche's work and see what they can find there that speaks to them. As Nietzsche said, the most common lie is that which one lies to himself. Lying to others is relatively an exception. So maybe the first step on this path of self-overcoming is to really confront our own self-deceptions and embrace the radical honesty that Nietzsche championed.
That's a powerful thought to leave us with. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the mind of Friedrich Nietzsche. Thanks for joining us.